The vast emptiness of space stretched endlessly, a sea of darkness punctuated by distant stars. Within this void, a lone vessel drifted, its silhouette illuminated only by the cold glow of its navigation lights. The ship was unassuming, a standard human cargo hauler, long, cylindrical, and devoid of any visible armaments. Its hull bore the insignia of a private trading company, a mere blip on the vast trade network that crisscrossed the outer rim. It moved at a slow, deliberate pace, its trajectory seemingly careless. Watching from the bridge of a heavily modified raider cruiser, Captain Kethvos leaned forward, his sharp green eyes narrowing as he studied the vessel on the holographic display. It was a prize too tempting to ignore. A single human transport, unescorted, drifting far from any known patrol routes. No visible defenses, no distress signals, no signs of an active crew. He smirked, his lips curling with satisfaction. "Scan it again," he ordered. A junior officer, a wiry man with nervous hands, ran another deep scan. The results flickered onto the display, confirming what Keth already suspected. "Minimal heat signatures, Captain," the officer reported. "One active life sign aboard, no armed security detected. The ship's log indicates it's carrying a cargo of medical supplies and rations." Keth's smirk widened. "One crew member, and no backup?" he chuckled, shaking his head. "Humans never learn. They think a few automated defenses will keep them safe." His second-in-command, a burly man with a scar running down his jaw, leaned against the console, arms crossed. "It's too easy," he muttered. "I don't like it." Keth shot him a sideways glance. "Since when have you been afraid of easy money?" "I'm not afraid, Captain. I just don't trust it. The last time we hit a lone human ship, it cost us half our boarding party." "That was a military transport," Keth reminded him. This is a slow, fat merchant with one poor soul on board. Probably a pilot too overconfident to pay for an escort." The second-in-command remained silent, but the tension in his jaw betrayed his unease. Keth, however, had already made up his mind. He had been raiding the trade routes for years, and he knew a good target when he saw one. This was not a warship. This was a gift. "Bring us in," he commanded. "Maintain stealth mode, no sudden movements, let's not spook him." The raider ship adjusted its course, gliding silently through the void. Its hull, coated in advanced light-dampening alloys, made it nearly invisible against the cold blackness of space. It crept toward the human vessel, closing the distance with practiced precision. Inside the cargo hauler, the lone crew member sat in the pilot's seat, seemingly unaware of the danger approaching. He was a man of average build, his posture relaxed, fingers lazily tapping against the control panel. He appeared entirely at ease, as if he had not a single worry in the world. Keth found that amusing. "Prepare the boarding crew," he said. "We'll take the bridge first. Secure the pilot. No unnecessary killing." A dozen raiders suited up, their weapons checked and primed. They moved with quiet efficiency, each one experienced in the art of quick and brutal takeovers. Their boarding craft detached from the cruiser, slipping through the darkness like a predator, closing in on wounded prey. Minutes passed. The cargo hauler remained still, oblivious to its impending fate. Then, without warning, the ship's comms crackled to life. Keth frowned. That wasn't supposed to happen. The human was hailing them? A voice, calm and unhurried, came through the speakers. "I assume you boys are planning to board," the pilot said. Silence filled the raider bridge. The crew exchanged glances, confused. Keth narrowed his eyes. How had the human detected them? "Don't bother playing dumb," the voice continued. "I noticed your approach 15 minutes ago. Stealth is good, but not perfect. You always forget to compensate for thermal drift." Keth clenched his jaw. This was unexpected. "And yet," he said into the comms, "you didn't call for help." The pilot chuckled. "Help? Against you? That's unnecessary." A slow, creeping unease settled in Keth's gut. He was familiar with bluffs. This didn't feel like one. "Boarding team," he barked. "Go in now. The raider boarding craft latched onto the cargo hauler's airlock. A few tense seconds passed as the override protocols activated, forcing the doors open. The raiders stormed inside, weapons raised. Then the screaming began. Keth shot to his feet. What the hell is happening? Through the crackling comms, he could hear his men shouting, no, shrieking. Gunfire erupted. Metal groaned under the weight of something enormous. A deep, guttural snarl cut through the chaos, followed by a wet, sickening crunch. One by one, the screams fell into silence. Then, nothing. Keth gripped the console, his mind racing. This was wrong. This was all wrong. The comms crackled again, but it was not his men's voices that came through. It was the pilot. You know, he said, his tone still maddeningly calm, you really should have done your research. A new scan of the ship flashed across Keth's display, but this time it wasn't showing just one life sign. It showed dozens, and they were moving. Keth's blood ran cold. What? The lights on the raider bridge flickered. The power surged. Then, in the darkness, something growled. The emergency lights flickered weakly, casting long, shifting shadows across the bridge of the raider cruiser. Keth stood frozen, his fingers gripping the edge of the console so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The silence pressing against his ears was deafening. No more screaming, no more gunfire. Just the faint crackle of static from the comms. His boarding party was gone. His heart pounded as he forced himself to breathe evenly. His mind raced through possibilities. His men had been some of the most ruthless raiders in the sector. They had stormed heavily armed military vessels before and lived to tell the tale. But this time they had not even managed to send a full distress call. Something had wiped them out. He jabbed a button on the console. Grev, report. No response. He tried another channel. Varric, do you copy? Only silence. He exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. His second-in-command watched him with dark, wary eyes, tension coiling in his stance. He was waiting for orders, waiting for Keth to say something that would make sense of what had just happened. Keth clenched his teeth. Pull up the internal feeds from their suits. The officer at the terminal hesitated before his fingers moved over the console. The screen flickered, and then a series of fragmented helmet camera feeds appeared. Distorted, filled with static, but still enough to send a cold shiver down Keth's spine. The first few seconds of the footage were normal, his men moving through the dim corridors of the human vessel, weapons raised, securing the airlock. Then, something changed. The perspective of one of the raiders jerked suddenly as he spun around. The grainy footage showed a corridor shifting, the bulkheads shifting, no, closing in. The walls themselves seemed to bend and twist. Then came the movement. Blurred shapes lunging from the darkness. Shadows that shouldn't have been there. Something massive tearing through armor like paper. The feed cut to black. Keth's fingers curled into fists as he forced himself to watch the next clip. It was even worse. The last clear image showed one of his men aiming his weapon, his face frozen in horror. Something moved behind him. Something Keth couldn't make out before the screen went dark. A deep, guttural growl echoed over the speakers. Then silence. The feeds were gone. Keth's blood turned to ice. His second-in-command exhaled through his nose. What the hell is on that ship? Keth didn't answer. He turned his gaze back to the human vessel, still floating undisturbed in the void. It looked so ordinary from the outside, a simple freighter with nothing remarkable about it. But inside, something had turned his best men into corpses within minutes. This wasn't a cargo ship. It was something else. He reached for the comms again, this time switching to a broad frequency, overriding all channels. Pilot, he said, forcing his voice to remain steady, I know you can hear me. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, the same maddeningly calm voice responded. You're persistent. That's admirable. Keth's fingers twitched over the console. He hated the way this man spoke, as if he was in control, as if he wasn't stranded alone on a ship that should have been a tomb. He forced his voice to remain cold. "What did you do to my men?" A soft chuckle came through the speakers. "I didn't do anything." Keth clenched his teeth. "Liar." "I told you before," the pilot continued, his tone unhurried. "You should have done your research." Keth's gut twisted. He needed information, fast. He turned sharply to his officer. "Scan for life signs again." The officer hesitated, fingers tapping at the controls. The results came back almost instantly. The display updated with a new reading. Keth stared. Dozens of life signs, more than before. Impossible. He felt his breath catch in his throat. That ship had been scanned. It had registered only one living being on board. Now there were at least 40. His second-in-command muttered a curse. "They weren't there before," the officer swallowed. "Captain, what if they were never meant to be detected?" Keth's pulse pounded in his ears. He knew of stealth tech that could mask heat signatures, but nothing that could erase life signs so completely. That meant only one thing. Whatever was on that ship had been there the whole time, hidden, waiting. And now it was awake. The pilot's voice came through the comms again, softer this time, almost amused. "I'll give you a choice, Captain. You can turn your ship around and leave." Keth bristled. "And let you go?" A quiet hum came through the speakers. "I'll be honest with you. If you leave now, you might live." Keth's grip on the console tightened. He wasn't about to back down. Not when he didn't even know what he was dealing with, but before he could speak, his ship's alarms blared. His officer's face drained of color. The display in front of Keth flickered with red warning signs. Movement. The human vessel had powered its engines, and it was coming straight at them. Keth's instinct screamed, "Get us back! Full thrusters!" The raider ship's engines roared to life, but something was wrong. The ship wasn't responding fast enough. The human vessel moved with an unnatural grace, closing the distance in seconds. Keth barely had time to register what was happening before the raider cruiser shuddered violently. The impact sent him crashing against the console. Sparks rained down from the ceiling. The entire bridge shook as though an invisible force had wrapped itself around the ship. "Shields are failing," the officer shouted. Keth forced himself upright, eyes darting to the screen. His cruiser had superior firepower, reinforced hull plating and energy shielding strong enough to withstand planetary bombardment. But somehow, the unarmed human vessel had breached its defenses in seconds. The ship groaned as something latched onto it. Not weapons, something else. Keth's blood ran cold. "What the hell is happening?" His officer's voice was raw with panic. "Captain, we're being boarded!" Keth turned to the screen, his pulse hammering. His own ship, his heavily armed raider cruiser, was being boarded. And for the first time in his life, he had no idea how to stop it. The impact reverberated through the raider's ship, a deep groaning sound that sent a shudder through the hull. Keth staggered as the bridge lights flickered wildly, casting eerie, jagged shadows against the walls. His ears rang with the sound of alarms, overlapping voices, and the panicked crackle of comms as his officers scrambled to make sense of what was happening. His second-in-command gripped the edge of the navigation console, his face pale beneath the dim emergency lighting. "Captain, something's breached the lower decks." Keth's pulse pounded against his skull. His ship had been boarded, but not by human soldiers. No gunships, no assault pods, no thermal detonations breaching the hull. Whatever had latched onto them had done so silently, bypassing all defensive systems as if his shields were nothing more than an afterthought. "Security teams, report." Keth barked into the comms, his voice sharp with barely restrained fury. Static hissed in response. One of his officers checked the internal scanners, his fingers trembling over the controls. "No visual on the intruders, Captain, but life signs." He stopped, his breath catching in his throat. Keth stepped forward, glaring at the screen. It showed movement. Dozens of unidentified life forms spreading through the lower decks, fast and erratic. Too fast. "Seal the bulkheads," Keth ordered. "Lock down all non-essential sections. Now." The officer fumbled with the controls, his hands slick with sweat. A moment later, the display confirmed the lockdown. Blast doors groaned into place across the lower levels, isolating the breach. For a fleeting second, Keth allowed himself to believe he had regained control. Then the screaming began. The sound erupted from the comms, short, desperate bursts of panic before being cut off, one after another. The security teams were armed to the teeth, trained to deal with the worst scum the galaxy had to offer, and yet something was tearing through them like paper. A guttural shriek cut through the static. Not human. Not anything Keth had ever heard before. It was deep, churning, layered with something wet and unnatural. The kind of sound that set something primal alight in the back of his skull, warning him that he was no longer the predator in this hunt. The lights flickered again. The emergency red glow cast harsh, shifting shadows across the walls. A faint vibration thrummed beneath his boots, something moving through the ship's framework. Keth exhaled sharply, forcing his mind to focus. He wasn't about to let his crew descend into chaos. Divert all remaining forces to the upper decks. We hold this line. Whatever that thing is, it's not taking my bridge. His second-in-command hesitated. Captain, if they've already reached, don't waste my time with doubt, Keth snapped. I need action. The man gritted his teeth and turned to relay the orders. The comms crackled to life again. Keth's stomach twisted as he heard the voice. The pilot, Captain, the voice murmured, calm as ever. You're still here. That's unfortunate. Keth's fingers curled into fists. What did you bring onto my ship? The pilot chuckled softly. I told you before, you should have left. Keth's patience snapped. I swear, if I get my hands on you, a deep metallic groan cut him off. The ship shook violently, knocking some of the officers to the floor. The vibrations felt different this time, more deliberate. Then the overhead vents burst open. Something long and black uncoiled from the ceiling like a serpent, its surface glistening under the flickering light. Keth barely had time to register the movement before the thing dropped into the room. It was fast. Too fast. A clawed appendage lashed out, striking one of his officers before he could react. The man let out a strangled cry as he was yanked into the darkness above. Blood spattered across the console where he had been standing. Keth reached for his sidearm, but another shape lunged from the shadows, slamming into the second-in-command with enough force to send him sprawling across the bridge. The creature was a blur, dark, sinewy, its form shifting unnaturally as if it was made of something that didn't quite obey the laws of flesh and bone. The second-in-command gasped as the creature loomed over him, its elongated head tilting as it studied him. Then, with terrifying precision, it struck. A sickening crunch filled the room. Keth fired. The shot tore through the thing's shoulder, sending a spray of thick, inky fluid across the deck. It barely reacted. Instead, it turned its head toward Keth, unblinking, unbothered. Keth's mind screamed at him to run. The thing moved again, faster than any living thing should. It was a blur of darkness, shifting through the bridge like liquid shadow, cutting down his crew with horrifying efficiency. Keth staggered back, his breath ragged. His ship, his bridge, it was falling apart around him. His officer's terrified voice rang through the comms. Captain, the ship! Keth turned toward the navigation screen. His blood ran cold. The human vessel wasn't just latched onto them. It was pulling them. The trajectory had shifted, dragging the Raider cruiser along with it, deeper into the black void of uncharted space. Keth's throat tightened. This wasn't just an ambush. It was a trap, and he had walked straight into it. The ship groaned under the immense force dragging it through space, a sound deep and guttural like the dying breath of a massive beast. Keth braced himself against the control panel, his fingers digging into the edge as the ship trembled violently. The gravity stabilizers struggled to compensate, sending loose debris skittering across the floor. Warning alarms blared in overlapping layers, drowning the bridge in a cacophony of red flashing lights and digital distress signals. The Raider cruiser, once a predator in the vast emptiness of space, was now being pulled like a carcass by something far more monstrous. Keth's breath came in sharp, measured bursts as he forced himself to think. His mind raced through the possibilities, each more absurd than the last. The human ship was dragging them. How? It had no visible tow cables, no gravitational tethers. The Raider cruiser should have been able to break free with sheer engine power, yet every attempt to maneuver only caused a violent backlash, like an insect caught in a spider's web. A sudden snarl tore through the bridge. Keth turned in time to see one of the creatures, a shadowy blur of sinewy limbs, drive its claws into the chest of an officer who had been scrambling for the weapons locker. The man's scream cut short as his body convulsed, his fingers twitching before falling limp. The thing tossed him aside with a disturbing casualness, its movements impossibly smooth, almost liquid. Keth raised his pistol and fired. The shot hit true, punching through the creature's side, sending thick, tar-like blood splattering against the wall. It barely reacted. Instead, its elongated head turned toward him, those black, featureless eyes locking onto his. It didn't hesitate. It lunged. He barely had time to throw himself aside. The thing crashed into the console behind him, sending a shower of sparks through the air. Keth rolled onto his knee, his grip on the pistol tightening. He fired again, aiming for the head. The creature moved unnaturally fast, but this time the shot connected. The bullet tore through its skull with a sickening crack. It staggered, its limbs convulsing, before slumping onto the deck. Keth didn't wait to see if it would get back up. He turned to his second-in-command, who was still on his knees, clutching a wound on his arm. "We need to get off this bridge," Keth barked. The man gave a sharp nod, his face pale but determined. He reached for his own weapon, his hands slick with blood. "Where to?" Keth exhaled, forcing himself to push past the growing dread clawing at his chest. "Armory first. Then we take back engineering." The second-in-command rose to his feet, gritting his teeth as he pressed against the wound. Together they moved toward the exit, stepping over the bodies of fallen officers. The air smelled of scorched metal and blood, thick with the acrid sting of burnt circuits. The ship trembled again, the unnatural force pulling them deeper into the void. As Keth reached the door controls, the comms crackled to life. "I assume by now," the pilot's voice came through, smooth and unwavering, "you understand what's happening." Keth ignored the static in his ears and pressed the override panel, forcing the door open. He and his second-in-command stepped into the corridor, weapons raised. "I understand that I'm going to put a bullet between your eyes," Keth snarled into the comms. The pilot chuckled. "You're still thinking too small, Captain. You think I'm your problem." Keth moved swiftly through the corridor, his boots clanking against the metal grating. The passage was dim, the emergency lighting casting jagged red streaks against the walls. He checked every shadow, every corner, waiting for another one of those things to lunge from the darkness. "You're losing," the pilot continued, his voice maddeningly calm. "Not because you're outnumbered, not because your ship is failing. You're losing because you don't understand where you are." Keth clenched his jaw. "I'm on my damn ship," another chuckle. "Are you?" The words sent an unexplainable chill through Keth's spine. Before he could respond, the ship lurched again, this time with enough force to send him crashing into the wall. His second-in-command barely managed to keep his footing, gripping a nearby railing as the entire deck groaned under an unseen pressure. The lights flickered. Then, for a brief moment, everything went completely dark. And in that darkness, Keth heard something move. Not just one thing, many. A scraping sound, claws against metal, a rhythmic clicking that sent a cold dread slithering down his spine. Then the lights returned, flickering weakly. The corridor ahead remained empty, but Keth knew, he knew. Something had shifted. His second-in-command exhaled sharply. "We need to move. Now." Keth didn't argue. They pressed forward, every step calculated. When they reached the armory, Keth punched in the access code, his pulse hammering in his ears. The door slid open with a slow hiss. Inside, rows of weapons gleamed under dim emergency lighting. He wasted no time grabbing a pulse rifle, tossing another to his second-in-command. "We're getting to engineering," Keth muttered. "If we can override." The ship lurched violently. The walls themselves seemed to stretch and bend for a fraction of a second, as if something far greater than them had pressed its weight against reality itself. The comms crackled again. "You can't fight the ship, Captain," the pilot murmured. "It's already part of you." Keth's breath hitched, and then he heard it. Not through the comms, not through any mechanical relay. Inside his head, a voice, ancient and endless, whispering in a language he didn't understand. But he felt it reaching, felt it pulling him deeper. The ship wasn't being taken, it had already been claimed. Keth gritted his teeth as he steadied himself against the rattling wall of the armory. The voice that had whispered inside his mind had faded, but the presence it left behind clung to him like the cold grip of death. His pulse hammered in his ears, every instinct screaming at him that whatever had overtaken his ship was not something he could fight in any conventional way. His second-in-command stood beside him, rifle raised, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill that now filled the corridors. The air itself felt heavier, as if the ship had become something else, something alive. "We need to get to engineering," Keth muttered, forcing himself to move. "If we can override the ship's control systems, we might." The walls shuddered. A deep groan resonated through the metal, not from the ship's structure, but from something deeper, something vast. His second-in-command tensed. "Might what, Captain? This thing isn't just in the ship. It is the ship." Keth clenched his jaw, unwilling to accept the truth so easily. He had fought in brutal wars, survived planetary invasions, and stolen ships from empires that thought themselves invincible. He would not die a coward, surrendering to something he didn't understand. He shoved forward, rifle at the ready, his boots echoing against the deck as he pushed through the corridor leading to engineering. Every step sent a pulse of unease through his bones. The ship no longer looked the same. The walls that had once been solid steel now rippled faintly, like stretched skin over something moving beneath. The lights above flickered, not from damage, but from an unseen will controlling them. Then he saw the first body. A radar officer, still clad in his uniform, stood slumped against the wall. His mouth was open, but no sound came. His eyes were hollow, black voids where pupils had once been. His chest rose and fell in slow, unnatural movements, though his body looked frozen in place. Keth raised his rifle. "Are you alive?" The officer's head twitched at the sound of his voice. Slowly, impossibly, his lips moved, but it wasn't his voice that came out. "You have already lost, Captain." Keth's breath hitched. The voice was the pilot's, smooth, detached. The officer took a single jerking step forward. His bones cracked as if they were no longer his own. Keth fired. The shot struck the man in the chest, sending him crumpling to the floor. No blood spilled. Instead, something black and viscous oozed from the wound, moving against gravity, crawling toward the wall where it disappeared into the metal. Keth exhaled sharply, his stomach tightening with revulsion. He turned to his second-in-command, who was staring wide-eyed at the spreading darkness along the walls. "We have to move." They sprinted down the corridor, every flickering light above them casting twisted, shifting shadows against the walls. The ship trembled, groaning as if it was breathing, adjusting. Keth no longer believed it was the gravity stabilizers failing. Something deeper was at work. Something had rewritten the ship itself. They reached the entrance to engineering. The door was sealed. Keth slammed the override panel, but the controls blinked red. Locked. A voice whispered from the speakers, "I told you before. You should have left." Keth growled under his breath, stepping back. "Stand clear." His second-in-command barely had time to react before Keth fired a burst from his rifle into the panel. The console sparked violently, and for a moment nothing happened. Then, with a slow hiss, the doors groaned open. Engineering was unrecognizable. The once sterile room of metal and machinery was now pulsating. Thick black veins of organic material had grown over the walls and floors, twisting around consoles, feeding into the ship's systems like roots burrowing into soil. The main reactor pulsed in a slow, steady rhythm, no longer humming with mechanical precision, but beating like a heart. Keth took a step forward, his boots squelching against the dark, shifting floor. He ignored the bile rising in his throat and moved toward the main terminal. If he could overload the core, he could destroy whatever had taken control of the ship. As he reached the console, something moved behind him. He turned just in time to see his second-in-command stiffen, his eyes going wide in shock. A dark tendril had erupted from the floor, wrapping around his torso, lifting him off the ground. His rifle clattered to the deck as he struggled, his hands clawing at the thing constricting his chest. Keth raised his weapon, but before he could fire, the tendril jerked violently, pulling the man into the darkness above. His scream was cut short. A wet, crunching sound echoed through the chamber. Keth's fingers tightened around the trigger, his breath sharp and ragged. He had no more time. He turned back to the console, his hands flying over the controls. The interface resisted him. It flickered with strange alien symbols, shifting and rearranging before his eyes. He ignored them, forcing a hard reset, bypassing every security protocol he had once used to steal ships in the past. The reactor shuddered. A low, warning hum vibrated through the deck. "You are making a mistake, Captain," the pilot's voice murmured from behind him. Keth didn't turn around. "I stopped listening to you a long time ago." He slammed his fist against the final override. The ship screamed, not an alarm, not a mechanical failure, a real, living scream. The entire structure convulsed, the walls twisting as if writhing in agony. The reactor pulsed faster, brighter, a core of raw energy surging beyond control. Keth stumbled back as the floor beneath him cracked, splitting apart, revealing the black void beyond. The ship was tearing itself apart. He turned and ran. The corridors twisted around him, collapsing, shifting as the entity inside the ship thrashed in its death throes. The lights overhead burst, showering him in sparks. Every step felt like running through a collapsing nightmare. He reached the nearest escape pod, throwing himself inside as the ship roared around him. The hatch sealed just as a final tremor shook the cruiser. Then, silence. The pod ejected. Keth watched from the viewport as his ship, his stolen, conquered war vessel, contorted one final time before imploding. A shockwave of energy rippled through space, sending debris scattering into the void. It was gone. He exhaled, his body shaking. His fingers dug into the armrests of the seat. He had survived, but something in his gut told him this wasn't over. The comms crackled one last time. The pilot's voice, soft, almost amused. "You think you won, Captain." Keth closed his eyes. The signal went dead.